Beloved community, how are you? We're closing out our series in Habakkuk. What a great 3 chapters this book is. Such an old book. For those of you that are just joining us, written 610, 612, so relevant to 2020. And let's face it, we're living in pretty extraordinary times. And while horrific things have always happened, it just seems the distribution capacity of mayhem and destruction have multiplied because of our communication ability. Even families of U.S. soldiers are being threatened these days. And I remember headlines back a number of years ago saying we were losing the race against Ebola. I guess we'll see headlines in October, November saying we're losing the race against COVID-19. In Portland this last weekend, radical extremists were burning Bibles and the American flag on the courthouse steps. Is anywhere safe these days? Leaders disappoint us, friends turn into enemies. We live in a falling world and nothing works as it's supposed to work. And it's going to get worse. When the power went out here, my Lord, we almost lost all our perishable foods for our food bank. It just seemed like the hits just keep coming. But a shout out to the Butler Fire Department and a shout out to the Bloomingdale Fire Department for helping us out and keeping the food pantry safe. Now, if you ever question God, like, God, why are you allowing all this? You woulda, shoulda, coulda, I know you could have, but you didn't. This is a great book for you. And we learned some survival skills in this book also. So lean in on this one. You want to lean in with me. Habakkuk was a minor prophet with a major message. And he's distraught over his culture. Everyone turned away from the law. And they're turning in on each other. They're taking advantage of each other. Violence everywhere. It just seemed like the bad guys were going to win this one. So he cries out to God with his list of complaints, and God actually answered him and told him, you know what, before it's over, Habakkuk, it's going to get worse. I'm going to allow the Babylonians to come in, and they're far worse. I'm going to let them level out all the corruption that was going on. It just didn't make any sense to Habakkuk. Why would it? God, if you're so good, why are you allowing all this bad to happen? Have you ever felt that way? It happens all the time. That's why on the bestseller list you see books like Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? So in chapter 1, quick review, Habakkuk's wrestling with all the hard questions and his emotions are boiling over. And he's like, how long must I cry out and you're not saving? I'm looking for answers. And there are times those answers come not in words, but in presence. Those of us that had surgeries done, the doctor comes in and he explains to you exactly what he's going to do. And sometimes in a little too much detail. I felt my stomach getting queasy when he was talking to me about something. And then when it comes time to get on the table and get rolled into the room, it's the anxiety and the uncertainty that generates fear. So God takes Habakkuk on a journey through time. And time is the canvas which God is painting on. And the big picture won't be complete until we get to eternity, and you'll all be able to see it. But right now, for I know in part, but then I'll know in full. Well, Habakkuk is in his encapsulated little frame by frame, and there was just violence and destruction, and God wasn't doing anything in his eyes. Now, in the 19th century, Nietzsche said God is dead. In the 20th century, it started out as the bloodiest century. If you put all the wars together, all the previous, from the 17th century, 18th, 19th, it had more deaths. It had 150 million killed. Now, granted, obviously the weapons of mass destruction were in play too, but it was the bloodiest century in history. It exceeded all the previous centuries together. And look how humans were treated in Nazi death camps. That was in 1941. That's not that long ago. And then in 1994, we had the genocide with the Tutsis in Rwanda. And the general response to those interviewed, or if you read it in books, was just, we were just ordinary people, going about the task of our day. Apparently we're all capable of such tragedy beyond our imagination. And if Habakkuk thought he was witnessing violence then, what would he say today? Violence is all around us. It really is. And all of us have been in a situation where we're struggling to understand the ways of God. So Habakkuk is screaming out, why do you tolerate this? Why do you tolerate wrong? Rabbi Zacharias made a point saying that when you lose a sense of justice, good government is gone. And it seems ethics are obsolete. We actually think the guilty party is the victim and the perpetrator of the crime. And that's how unjust society has really become. I mean, you can see the pulverizing of the law in any courtroom by a slick lawyer. The victim becomes the most victimized. And what did Habakkuk say? The law is paralyzed, justice has come perverted. And it's still going on. And he talks about evil, and he talks about the wicked overcoming the righteous. There's so much battling going on today with the left and the right. We forget there's an up and a down. When you forget there's an up and a down, you'll always be battling with the left and the right. What's politically correct? We forget there's a right and a wrong. And we lost our way. So in chapter 2, Habakkuk has to wait and wait and wait. And he's put in God's waiting room and he's brought to school. And we wait patiently. God tells Habakkuk to wait patiently. I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. So you just sit there and wait. And no one likes to do that. But we need to learn to give up control and surrender our burdens to God. So if you lean in and do not give up, God will bring you to a new level of faith and trust. I mean, that's exactly what we see in chapter 3. This is a complete transformation now. How do we worship God in tough situations, in tough circumstances? And what we're going to see is, we're going to see a prayer, we're going to see a vision, and we're going to see a testimony. He's got a new song in his heart. Most of chapter 3 is going over the history and all the things that God has done, and that was the vision that God gave him. One of the ways to get in touch with the goodness of God when nothing is going right is to remember what God has done in the past. If you could remind yourself how God has worked in your life. And this is where, when you get to that place, it's like next level worship. You don't, instead of your life falling apart, you see it was actually falling in place. Wow. And that's a transformation. This is where, when you lean in, this starts to happen this way. Habakkuk had a new clarity, had a new perspective, and now he changed from fear to faith. And we were told this before in James chapter 1. It said, "Dear brothers and sisters, when troubles of any kind come your way, consider it an opportunity for great joy." What? For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. So he's not saying, hey, being joyful when everything's crashing down around you. That's probably better living through chemistry. But being joyful by overcoming. You stayed the course. It's an opportunity for growth. And God says, if you hang in there, I will do something wonderful in you. I will make you like Jesus. You will be Christ-like. The parts of his nature, little microcosms of his nature, Christ formed in me. And that's what the whole Christian journey is all about. It's on the same line as when Jesus said, "Blessed are you when you're persecuted." Why? For great is your reward. Wow. If you stay the course, you'll see what I'm doing. Peter brought it up also. So be truly glad, he said. 1 Peter 1. There's a wonderful joy ahead, even though you must endure many trials for a little while in light of eternity. These trials will show that your faith is genuine. It's being tested as fire tests and purifies gold, though your faith is far more precious than mere gold. So if you're struggling today, and who isn't, everything's going according to plan. It's hard for us to see what God's doing in our lives. Just like God's saving purposes in the lives of Joseph and Job and David, and even Jesus himself. Many who welcomed Jesus as the Messiah, they had their expectations dashed when he died on the cross, and they crucified him and they tortured him so. They couldn't imagine how is God honoring his promises by letting this tragedy happen. It's the same thing, But we remember that what Jesus did. But we remember what Jesus did every time we take communion. The blood and that which represents his body. It's remembering what God did in the past, right? And God is doing a work in you that couldn't be done in any other way. And we all have our cross to bear. There have been generations and generations and generations of God delivering his people. Habakkuk 3 is filled with hope and praise. And he had another vision, remembering what God did in the past, going all the way back to the Exodus when the Israelites had their back to the sea and the Egyptian army was bearing down on them, and God parted the waters. And God constantly showed his great, great power in spectacular ways to deliver them from impossible situations. In verse 8, he's saying, Habakkuk is saying, why'd you do all those miracles to deliver us from Egypt? Was it in anger that you struck the rivers and parted the sea? Were you displeased with them? No, you were sending your chariots to salvation. God, when you did all those supernatural things, you weren't angry at nature, were you? Well, what were you doing then? You were delivering. You split the earth with rivers. The mountains saw you and writhed. The torrents of water swept by. The deep roared and lifted its waves on high. Wow. In other words, you did it in the past. In the days of Joshua, you did it in the sky. Look at verse 11. The sun and the moon stood still in the sky as your brilliant arrows flew and your glittering spear flashed. And he's talking about when God made the sun stand still to give the victory to the forces of Israel. The Old Testament is history. It's his story. It's God's story, his story with his people. It's not just stories for allegorical purposes. Verse 13 is the key because he sums it up. He says, you came out to rescue your chosen people. I'll stop there because that was the whole purpose. All right? All of this display of your great power was to deliver your people. So part of our faith is that God has acted in the past, and he's shown it in the past, and he will do it again. So you need to remember when you're in a crunch spot, when you're down in the pit or down in the dip, whatever you want to call it. Remember how God acted in the past in your life and return to what you did in the beginning, whether it was the fellowship of the saints, prayer, the reading of his word, but just return to the things and this is one-on-one, this is one-on-one marriage counseling too, but we are the bride of Christ. But no one can hinder the purposes of God when they're set in motion. And God working in your life will give you the assurance that you are in his hands. Look at that great verse in Philippians 1. Being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. Look, he's not going to drop you halfway. What he starts, he finishes. And what God completes, no one can undo. You are righteous. You are. He knew you before you were in your mother's womb. And you will be in his hands when he takes you home. I go to prepare a place for you. And if it were not true, I would have told you so. History doesn't just keep going round and round. It doesn't. It's linear. We're moving towards a destination. The prophetic clock has been set in motion, and God's purpose will be revealed and shown to everybody. An atheist would say that you go on the ground and you decay and it's over and that's the end of it. Or you could take the biblical worldview. In 1 Thessalonians, the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with commanding shout, and there will be the voice of the archangel and the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. And Paul told us in Corinthians, so it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown perishable, what is raised is imperishable. No more decay, no more corruption, just eternal hope. There's a grave. There's a grave in Cyprus that Rabbi visited, and it purports to be the grave of Lazarus. And Lazarus was a pastor or bishop of the church there. And it says on the words, the inscription reads, Lazarus, friend of Jesus, twice dead. Wow. How do you frighten someone that's already been dead and brought back to life and he's a friend of Jesus? That's incredible. So in Habakkuk's time, this is one of the darkest times in Israel's history. But Habby got completely transformed in chapter 3. And he went from asking, why, to you. He's recounting all the ways that God acted for his people. And now he's focused on the greatness and the glory of God and the awesome power. And he ends up with one of the most beautiful portions of Scripture in the Bible. And it's a climax to the whole book. But first, he gives us a good inside peek to the reality of his emotions. This isn't a verse you'll see on any mug, on any coffee mug, or any T-shirt, I can assure you. I trembled inside when I heard this. My lips quivered with fear. My legs gave way beneath me, and I shook in terror. I will wait quite quietly for the coming day when disaster will strike the people who are about to invade us. So Habakkuk is scared. What he saw is just, it's having a physical effect on him. He's he got rocked by the vision and what was yet to come. And just like some of us get rocked when we hear devastating news. It was horrifying to him, but it's horrifying to us if we hear something about our health or something about our loved one. I mean, when I had to tell my father that my mother passed, it was the same thing. His lips quivered, his legs gave out from underneath him, and he was shaking all over. I literally had to just sit him down. Habakkuk is not happy about what's to happen. There's going to be famine. There's going to be death. It's going to be a complete distress in a time of trouble, like never was before on Israel. And he realizes, though, I just have to give up control of this. It's hard to do that, or any of us. But he knows what's coming, and he needs to rest in the now before the Lord. And he surrenders control of his future to God. And then he puts this poetic prayer to music. So I believe Habakkuk was either a priest or a rabbi, whatever you want to say, and he gave this to the musicians. And it wasn't like he was being creative. He was just saying what was about to go down. Verse 17, even though the fig trees have no blossoms, there are no grapes on the vines. Even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. Why? Because the sovereign Lord is my strength, and he makes me as sure-footed as the deer, able to tread upon the heights. Wow. God positions you in a way to see your current reality through different eyes, and that's our hope. And I'm so grateful for that, because if you look around, all we see is negative news right now. There's cultural upheaval. And no one's really sure about sending the kids back to school. They're doing the best they can to keep everybody safe. But there's a lot of tension in the air. The nurses are yelling at the teachers to do their job, and the teachers are yelling back, well, I didn't sign up for what you signed up for. And we need to remember that God has not stopped working because the world is slowed down or shut down, and people are just turning on each other. The left is fighting with the right. Everybody's fighting, and God's right in the middle of it saying, whoa. We need to remind ourselves that we're not alone in this. And we need to know he's at work and enabling us to go to these higher places with him. Habakkuk experienced transformation. Here's a good point. None of the circumstances changed. Israel's still in rebellion. The people around them are still violent. The Babylonian invasion is still on its way. Outwardly, everything is as messed up as it was in chapter 1. Yet now, through prayer and vision that God gave him, we see Habakkuk receiving joy in the Lord, which is something that no one can take away from him. He had a completely new song in his heart. In his prayer, back in verses 1 and 2, it's not on the screen, but you can read it at home, but you see complete awe of God's power. And then in the middle of that, he prays for mercy. Lord, I'm not going to stop your plan, obviously, and you put it in motion, but please remember mercy, otherwise we're all finished. And he's saying it again. What he's saying is, Lord, you did it in the past. Do it again in our time. Do it again. And that should be a backdrop for our times right now. God, you did it in the past. Do it again. And there's that whole vision of Habakkuk's asking God to do something. And the vision was God's answer to Habakkuk. In the 21st century, we should surely be thinking, you know what? God, do it again because you did it in the past. And we know you're still God. And his testimony was basically, I know all of what you said will take place, but I will wait. And while I'm waiting, I am going to worship you. The Babylonians that come in, all of what Habakkuk said in that song, that's exactly what took place. No fig trees blossoming. No grapes on the vine. All earthly necessities will be gone. The invasion will wipe out any luxuries and necessities. The economy is going to be liquefied. No jobs, no investments, everything disappears. What would we do? The stock market implodes, the pensions are gone, the 401 is gone, the food's running out, loved ones are terminal. What if America falls victim to a foreign power? Which, come on, think about it. What if we end up in jail for our faith? What do we do then? What will we do when really hard times come upon us? And are we going to be angry with God, or are we going to believe in God anyway? This is what's going on. And the translation, this whole thing is, when everything is crashing down all around me, I will worship. It reminds me of Job. When everything got taken away from Job, sell everything. And Job just said, you know what, though he slay me, yet will I live. I mean, that's beautiful. Faith is not about our feelings or circumstances. Habakkuk will wait patiently, and I am going to rejoice while I'm waiting. It almost reminds me of the musicians on the Titanic. Seriously, I don't know why the image just popped in my head. You know, they were playing as the boat's going down. And they said, all right, let's return to what we know, you know. Return to your first love. And then he says, get some hinds feet. In the King James, that feet of the deer, it says hinds feet. Hinds feet to get above it all and worship God. I'm not going under. I'm going to get some hinds feet and I'm going to get above it. I will rejoice, jump and dance. That joy and rejoice, it means to jump up and down and spin all around. I mean, and in the Lord, and the Lord is the joy of my salvation. That's what he's saying. It's like Paul and Silas in prison awaiting a possible beheading party, and they start singing worship songs. You need to get in touch with what made them sing. And God, who uses nations as tools to judge other nations, but then judges those nations. This God has a personal relationship with me. Verse 18, the God of my salvation. You see it? You could take everything away but knowing him. And you can't take away that which satisfies and brings joy to my soul. Knowing God and having a relationship with him is more than enough. Wow. You know? And remember that he cares for you. And just a sidebar, does any of this sound like the prosperity gospel to you? I mean, seriously, come on. If you just have strong enough faith, God will bless your stock markets. God will bless, you'll have a Ferrari and a Lambo. I mean, come on. You know, to tell someone who suffered loss of earthly blessings because they lacked faith is spiritual malpractice. God and God alone is enough for me and for me to experience the joy and salvation. This is completely next level worship. Not for the blessings in my life, not for anything but who he is. Not for what he gives me, not because I think I'm going to live a happier life, but because of who he is and who I am in him. There's now a peace in my heart. Before I had an anxiety that I couldn't control, and now I have a peace that I can't explain. And it's because he knew God. And when you know God and that joy, you get a joy like that, that's unshakable. The hinds feet, God gives us hinds feet to navigate the difficult cliffs that we face. And he sets us upon higher places and makes us agile. He takes care of us. He gives you strength to rise above the battle and go to the mountaintops to stay safe from the dangers below. And he gives precious freedom that only comes from knowing him. So you can run from the top to the bottom with sure footing because he will make my feet like hinds feet and they can run through some very rough places. You got some deer's feet. You can run and make it through. And he ends his words with seeing who God is and singing praise to him. And he's reached a place where God spoke inwardly to him and gave him a peace. Habakkuk won't live long enough to see God take care of the Babylonians. He will be dead by then. But this book ends with worship, and that's where we're going to end also. And the important takeaway, like I said, nothing's changed. Hard times are coming, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. Nothing's changed on the outside. People still have forgotten God, and people are still violent, and the Babylonians or the Chinese, whatever you want to say, they're coming, right, at some point. But nothing's changed, but there's been a great, great change in Habakkuk. So there's nothing too hard for the Lord. I mean, you could be born with no arms or legs, and you could turn out to be a Christian motivational speaker, one like no other. I mean, just ask Nick Volvacek. God will make a way where there is no way. And if there is no way, he will create a way because God still creates today. So he will make a way with you. Walk humbly, but know that you're strong. Let's pray together. Father, you hide yourself in history, but you don't hide yourself in your word. And many, many times we cannot discern you working in our lives. But we read about your saving purposes in the lives of others. And it becomes clear that you never fail to help and to save. We thank you for your word. Help us to trust in it. We love you. Thank you for who we are in you. And Lord, if there's someone listening and they're really going through that crunch, I pray right now they could just cast their burdens onto you and trust you with them and leave them there. And if they open up their heart and just say, Lord, I need you. Jesus, thank you for saving me on that cross. Come into my heart. Give me your life. Now I give you mine. And I pray this in your name. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to hand you over to some worship now to Darren.
Who, oh Lord, could save themselves? Their own soul could heal. Our shame was deeper than the sea. Your grace is deeper still. Who, oh Lord, could save themselves? Their own soul could heal. Our shame was deeper than the sea. Your grace is deeper still. And you alone can rescue. You alone can save. You alone can lift us from the grave. You came down to find us, led us out of death. To you alone belongs the highest praise. You, oh Lord, have made a way, the great divide you healed. For when our hearts were far away, your love went further still. Yes, your love goes further still. You alone can rescue. You alone can save. You alone can lift us from the grave. You came down to find us, led us out of death. To you alone belongs the highest praise. To you alone belongs the highest praise. Here we go. We lift up our eyes, lift up our eyes, you're the giver of life. We lift up our eyes, lift up our eyes, you're the giver of life. We lift up our eyes, lift up our eyes, you're the giver of life. We lift up our eyes, lift up our eyes, you're the giver of life. We lift up our eyes, lift up our eyes, you're the giver of life. We lift up our eyes, lift up our eyes, you're the giver of life. We lift up our eyes, lift up our eyes, you're the giver of life. We lift up our eyes, lift up our eyes, you're the giver of life. And you alone can rescue. You alone can save. You alone can lift us from the grave. You came down to find us, led us out of death. To you alone belongs the highest praise. To you alone belongs the highest praise. To you alone belongs the highest praise.